Everyone, we will be starting the webinar in about 5 minutes. We are currently playing background music, so if you can't hear any background music, please shoot your audio settings. And if you need any technical assistance, just reach us through the chat module. See you soon. Evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Janine. I am from Design Singapore Council and I will be your MC for today. So hello to everyone joining us on Facebook. If you would like to join us over here on Zoom, please click on the link in the comments. So thank you everybody for joining us for our webinar today, To Our City with Love. Today's session is brought to you by Design Singapore Council, the National Agency for Design in Singapore, in partnership with Centre for Livable Cities, Deloitte Centre for the Edge, Participate in Design and the Urban Redevelopment Authority in support of the Singapore Together movement. This event is also part of the National Design Centre's program lineup in August and September with a thematic focus on Singapore, our home. So when you entered the webinar, you may have noticed a few polls on your screen. Through the polls, we are hoping to get a broad sense of how everyone here views lovability in Singapore. So if you have not had the chance to take the poll, please complete it now. We will be sharing the results of the poll later during the discussion. Before we proceed, I would like to highlight a few housekeeping notes, which you can see on the screen. So do note that the session is being recorded. If you encounter any technical issues, you can reach our technical team through the Zoom chat function. And we ask for your patience and understanding should conditions be less than perfect. During this webinar, your audio will be on mute by default. However, we welcome questions anytime during the session using the Zoom Q&A function. And if you look on the screen now, you can see where that would be. Now, when you're posing a question, could you please state your name, where you're from, and if you have a specific panelist that you'd like to respond to your question, let us know as well. All right, and with this, we would like to kick off this evening's program with opening remarks by Mr. Mark Wee, Executive Director of the Design Singapore Council. So Mr. Mark Wee is a design thinking pioneer in Singapore, having designed award-winning innovative experiences for the public and private sector. As a design veteran with wide industry connections, Mark has brought the work of the Council to the attention of global design leaders. He's by training an architect who was recognized by the Urban Redevelopment Authority in 2017 as the top 20 under 45 architects in Singapore that would redefine the next generation. And now, please welcome Mark for the opening remarks.
Well, hello, everyone. Hi. Hopefully, y'all can. Hi, everyone. So good evening. Just thank you all for just coming on board. Good evening, everyone. Kind of welcome to our webinar, To Our City with Love. As you know, this is actually the first of a two-part series of exploring what a lovable Singapore actually means to us. So like Janine shared, I'm Mark, the Executive Director of the Design Singapore Council. I'm super happy and welcome to you all to see that tonight there's such a diverse kind of audience from Singapore and also beyond our shores. I understand that today actually we have guests from Europe, Australia, Korea, and other Asian cities as well. And thank you for all joining us this evening. A number of guests may be joining us for the first time, so I'd like to just take a few moments to actually introduce the council and what we actually do. As a national agency for design, our vision is actually for Singapore to be an innovation-driven economy and a lovable city through design. Our work actually focuses on three areas. First, we help organizations and enterprises actually use design as a strategy to grow businesses and deliver people-centered public services. Secondly, what we do is we nurture industry-ready talent and actually enable a design-minded workforce for the future economy. And the third, we actually advance the Singapore brand through raising design appreciation on home ground and making hopefully emotional connections with people across the world, for example, through a through a webinar like this tonight. The question of what makes a city lovable is actually very close to our hearts at the council. This is also a question that's been actually increasingly important around the world. And we've heard the statistics, right? Today, about 55% of the world's population lives actually in urban areas. And by 2050, 2/3 of the global population will actually live in cities, according to the UN. Along with that, we are facing increasingly complex, what we call wicked problems like climate change, aging population, and economic recession as a result of geopolitical uncertainties. And the emotional connections we have with the places and the spaces we live in will be crucial, we feel, in galvanizing resilience, engagement, and collaboration actually to come together to find creative solutions. So hence, we are very, very interested in how a lovable city is actually designed and how we can design a lovable Singapore. In fact, this is actually encapsulated in our Design Master Plan 2025, which you could download online. And the master plan, if you've not looked through it, was actually put together by a committee comprising first of policy makers, design and business leaders who actually came together to craft a vision of Singapore's future by design, of which would be an innovation-driven economy and a lovable city. And while we have indices to actually map and measure our progress towards an innovation-driven economy, we actually have yet to articulate a shared vision for a lovable city. And this is our council's goal, to actually investigate what a lovable Singapore could look like to all of us, and to gather a group of like-minded people from the public and private sector to investigate this with us. Over the past few months, our council has actually worked with other public agencies, such as the Urban Redevelopment Authority, the URA, the Singapore Together Secretariat, under the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, and the Centre for Livable Cities, as well as consultancies like Deloitte's Center for the Edge and Participate in Design. And together, we actually began to process the process of engaging groups of people in Singapore about this topic itself. We posed ourselves actually two key research questions for this project. First, what do we love about Singapore? And second, what will make us love Singapore more? And to this end, we've actually run 4 focus group sessions, spoken to experts across the fields of arts, heritage, design, business, and academia, and interviewed Singaporeans, permanent residents, and long-time residents of Singapore. We've actually uncovered insights that both confirm our hypothesis, as well as those that have intrigued and challenged us. Some of our earlier findings have actually shown us that we need to expand our definition of lovability. The breadth of stories that we received have been actually remarkable. From the 20-something-year-old student who told us he loves our transport system because of the sense of adventure it gives him in accessing so many areas of Singapore, to the older couple who told us how well designed the streetscape is, that someone loved it enough to do a good job. And people spoke about their love for the mature trees around the city, the sense of neighborliness, and the ability to make a significant impact on society. We've also heard stories about how much more work Singapore has to do in achieving a truly inclusive society. Elderly folk who are feeling marginalized in terms of technology, language, and accessibility of public spaces, and new citizens who are unsure of what role they actually can play here on the island. So the sheer diversity of viewpoints have actually both inspired and galvanized us to expand our outreach to more people and thus gather more voices. And some of our participants have asked us bluntly, what is the point of asking people about lovability in a time such as this, in the middle of a pandemic and a global recession? And this is a question we have asked ourselves as well. Undoubtedly, the current crisis has both thrown into relief the best and worst of human nature around the world. It has especially laid bare the huge social and economic inequalities that already exist. In Singapore, We saw this most clearly with problems around our foreign worker dormitories. And however, we also saw the most impressive ground-up, community-driven efforts by groups like the COVID-19 Migrant Support Coalition, as well as other types of projects like Mass Sown with Love. Within the design community, many have also stepped up to donate time, resources, and their design skills to enhance safe practices, share knowledge, and boost morale. For example, there's a campaign called Thank You Delivery Heroes, which was appreciative posters for delivery workers by a local creative agency, Kinetic. And numerous designers also went about sewing or 3D printing masks and shields, which they generously donated. So this, therefore, might not be the most convenient time to ask what we love about Singapore and how we can make it more lovable. However, it is an extremely important time to do so, we feel. It is a time to ask ourselves some honest questions about how we stand together as a community and reassess what is important to us collectively and frame our local identity, culture, heritage, and bonds. If we believe that lovable cities are the ones that are inclusive, community-driven, and resilient, then there's really no time like the present to ask ourselves if Singapore is truly lovable for everyone, and what we can do to make it more so, especially for groups that are less heard from. So I'm heartened that these are the very topics our panelists and moderator are here to discuss this evening. And we got leaders from the world of arts and culture, social enterprise, research, and think tanks. And I'm excited for a super robust, boundary-pushing discussion. And I'm also really looking forward to hearing our audience's thoughts as well during the polls and Q&A later. So with this, I'd love to hand the time over to our esteemed panelists, and I wish everyone a very, of course, lovable evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. So before we launch into our panel discussion, I would just like to briefly share more about the Lovable Singapore study that Design Singapore Council is driving together with our collaborating partners. So when we first started on this project and started talking to stakeholders and interested parties about what they find lovable about Singapore, the most recurring question people asked us was, what do you mean by love? So after several similar such conversations, it became clear to us that one important task we have would be to unpack and articulate the definition of love, how love is felt and expressed between people and the place they live in. The diversity of viewpoints and the breadth of the topic make this a challenging task, but as Mark just mentioned, also a very necessary one in these times. Another driving motivator behind the project is that although our initial surveys found that most respondents find Singapore very livable, Singapore is clearly not lovable to everyone. In fact, it might even be unlovable to many people at some point in their lives. So we want to delve deeper, more deeply into what these pain points are. Are they an inevitable aspect of living in a dense, fast-paced environment? Or is this something we can make lovable by design? And so, besides drawing together an articulation of lovability, our other goal is also to uncover insights that would help us identify opportunities to make Singapore more lovable. And so the Lovable Singapore project is in two parts. The first is a comprehensive study with Singaporeans and Singapore residents. This will launch in October and run till December, aiming to engage more than 2,000 people. The second part of the project is to then translate the findings of the study into insights that can create meaningful, actionable outcomes in terms of projects, programs, and prototypes. And we hope to launch this early next year. So how can you take part? Well, first we need your voices. So please start by taking part in our polls and the Q&A segment tonight. If we can't get to your questions tonight, we are actually going to invite our panelists to share their answers post-webinar, and we will in turn share these on our website and through social media. Also, please do join us for the second webinar of this series, where we will officially launch the study and invite everyone's participation. So this will be on the 30th of September, and we will share more details at the end of this webinar. All right, so with that, let's move on to tonight's program and allow me to introduce our speakers. First is our moderator, Mr. Dulisha Kulasurya, Executive Director of Deloitte Center for the Edge. Dulisha is the lead strategist for Deloitte's Center for the Edge, a research institute exploring the edges of business and technology. Over the past decade, they have explored how the world is changing in very dramatic ways as a result of ever-evolving digital infrastructure and changing public policy. And they explore the implications on us as individuals and institutions. Joining him today on today's panel, we have three wonderfully diverse panelists. So first, Ms. Yvonne Tam, Chief Executive Officer of the Esplanade. Yvonne has been at the Esplanade since 2014, overseeing its strategic and social objectives as a performing arts center for everyone. She also serves on the board of Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, SISTIC.com, the Council of the Association of Asia Pacific Performing Arts Centers, Singapore Film Commission Advisory Committee, and the Urban Redevelopment Authority's Heritage and Identity Panel. Next, we have Mr. Tong Yi, Executive Director of Common Ground. Yi is the co-founder of Singapore's largest group of social enterprises that focuses on building social and emotional capital in Singapore. So these comprise Thought Collective, School of Thought, Think Tank Studio, Food for Thought, and Common Ground. His works span across innovative placemaking projects, curriculum design, organizational design, change management, and innovation. He is also currently part of a number of national committees, including Families for Life Council and Singapore Discovery Centre. Finally, we have Ms. Lauren Sorkin, Executive Director of the Global Resilient Cities Network. Lauren oversees global efforts to strengthen cities in the face of complex and interconnected challenges. She's on the advisory board of several sustainability-focused initiatives, including Food Tank, the Singapore Sustainability Summit, and Natural Capital. She also serves as an advisor and spokesperson on topics like urban resilience, women's leadership, sustainable finance, climate risk, stakeholder engagement, and urbanization trends. So welcome all speakers. And now over to you, Dulisha.
Hello? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm Yvonne.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. It's great to be part of this discourse. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Mark. And I want to talk to everyone about like how we'd want to spend the next hour plus with everyone here in the group. A little bit more context to myself and Center for the Edge. Like Janine mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Center for the Edge for Asia Pacific. I just moved to Singapore last year from San Francisco. Been in the US for many years and ran the Center for the Edge in part for the last 12 years. And came out here to Singapore last year to start the Center for the Edge in Asia Pacific. And we are called the Center for the Edge because we believe that all disruptions emerge from the edge, and that's what we explore. So for lack of a better term, we're like futurists. But Singapore isn't by happenstance. We moved here, we choose to move here because we have a strong affinity to this. I've been traveling back and forth to Singapore for many years now, but my wife happens to be Singaporean. So this is in part our return to Asia. I grew up in Sri Lanka. And to be much more part of this part of the world, which I believe is an edge demographically and geographically that the rest of the world can learn from. I have an amazing panel here with Tong Yi, Yvonne, and Lauren. What we'd like to do today is to stretch this topic of lovability. I got engaged in this topic because we've done some similar work in the US, looking at some of these up and coming cities like Pittsburgh, looking to see what could make these cities more livable, lovable. And so I've been part of this journey for a couple of months now with DSG as an external advisor. But at this point, we're taking this public. We're taking this to all of you. We want your input. This webinar is going to have some limited ways of gauging input. We had a poll at the beginning. We'll have another poll at the end. Please put in your questions. If you can, we'll try and answer them today. If we can't answer them today, we'll answer them at a later point. But we really want your input into this. So here's how the next hour plus is going to go. We'll start off by getting to know our panelists, give them kind of a basic question like we did with you. But they're here for very specific reasons. So we want to delve a little deeper into each of their perspectives that we can bring together. We want them to challenge. We want them to go beyond the obvious. And let's see if collectively we can figure out how to make Singapore a more lovable place. So I have an easy question for everyone. If anything around love is easy, to start off with our panelists. And Tongi, I'm going to start with you first. And I'm going to go to each of the panelists with the same question. But what does lovability mean to you? And as a follow-up to that, if not Singapore, which country might be most lovable to you?
Right. Lovability. How much time do we have? So the short answer is lovability for me is really not about, cute big-eyed animals or something itself that I adore or something itself I'm fascinated with. I think lovability around is really about relationship for me. It's about the quality of the relationship, the quality of the trust relationship. And whether or not I feel that I think the words I find over here is whether I feel constituted of, whether I feel a part of something. So that's a real important part that when I enter into a city or enter into a space, whether or not I feel connection with the space. And that's what typically makes me feel loved. Yeah.
And is there a city that you like that would come to mind as most lovable for you?
I think what's fascinating for me over here is this whole idea of, if you ask me about Cape Town, London, Istanbul as cities, I love them all. As in fact, I'm in love with them. But whether or not I can claim to love them, I think is another thing. I was just reflecting over the idea of the distinction between a relationship with a wife or a mistress.
Yes, I do recall that conversation.
But I want to say this for the yeah, but it was interesting over here because I do a lot of marriage mediation, and people oftentimes over here say that in the relationships that they have within the marriages, sometimes in the marriages, shadows are created, and they start to create, they start to look for, other relationships that can satisfy this particular shadow. And I think when I go to Cape Town, Istanbul, London, I tend to actually start experiencing a very different life that I would in Singapore. I have this illusion that I'm in love with these cities. But if you ask me like whether or not I truly love Singapore, I think my commitment is really here. So I could be in love with others, but really my relationship is with Singapore. Yeah.
So to you, okay, very good. So it's a great way to start us off. You bring a distinction between being in love and loving, and the commitment and the relationship and the trust and being part of that's required for that. So let's take the same question to you, Yvonne. What does lovability mean to you in the context of a city? And if not Singapore, is there another city that comes to mind when you think of lovability?
Yvonne, you're on mute.
Yeah, we are mute. Sorry, this is like classic Zoom time statement, right? But no, I was just saying I love how Tongi spoke about wife and mistress, simply because for the men, that just means, sorry, I don't want to make this gendered, but when that first question was posed to me, or when I, Mark and you guys asked me to be part of this, I'm like, how do you talk about love if you do not speak of love in the context of a relationship? So I do agree with you, because it's not the same as saying, I love a glass of wine, I love this restaurant. But, any relationship or anything that we talk about that is of meaning or value, you go back to that very prime covenant, right? So be it a marriage vow or your partner, or, the love between a mother and a child. So that to me is very, very core. And to me, lovability says as much about the lover as it is about the beloved. So you always look for, it reflects actually your values, right? So you look for in your lover or your beloved, whatever it may be, those same values that you seek for yourself. So I would say when we look at a city, it says very much about who we are as a people by what we say we love about that city. And it is this dynamic, right? The city is not a kind of an object or something that is fixed. It is constantly reflecting and relating back to its lover or its beloved. So my question oftentimes when you guys speak of lovability of a city, who is the lover of the city, and who does the city love? You know, does the city love the folks who's parking their wealth here, or does the city love, you know, its citizens? Does the city love, who does the city love? And I think that then tells how decisions are made for that city. If I have a city that I love other than Singapore, it will be Taipei. Very simple reason. I go there every year with my late husband, so it's got memories of love for me. But also, I think it's a city that, you know, people have fought very hard to love. If you go to that city, you know, it's been defined by citizens or people who chose, partly because of the threat of China, of course, to say how it's different, right? So it's different because of its nature, it's different because of its history. You know, it's a city that constantly has to say why it needs to exist and why it needs to be different, and its people want it to be so. And you can see that everywhere, in its public transport, in its public sector advertisements in the public transport. You speak to anyone on the street, you know, they can hate, they can complain about the government, but everything they do is because they really love that city. You know, you meet a stranger in the streets. I remember my first trip to Taipei, we bought a pair of shoes, and the guy who's selling us the pair of shoes just went, "I'm going to go up the mountains on my motorbike. You know, it's my favorite place in the city. Do you want to come along?" Now, if you are not in love with your girlfriend or boyfriend or your husband or your mistress for that matter, you're going to hide them in the shadows. But if you love something, you just want to show it off. You want to go everywhere with that person. You want to do everything with that person, and you want to post photos of that person on your Instagram. You know, that to me is a sign of why, and that love is very infectious. Yeah.
So it seems like there are a lot of parallels between Singapore and Taipei in some ways, the reasons to exist and all of that. It also seems like you're mirroring what Tong Yi said about a relationship, a two-way thing. It's not about just you loving them, but the city loving you back and indicating what it loves by its behavior and what it does. Excellent. So I'm going to come back to some of those points when you get to us. Lauren, can we pull you in as the outsider, but also insider to Singapore? You should also talk about the connection to Singapore. Lauren, what does lovability mean to you? And if not Singapore, what might be most lovable to you?
Thanks, Delisha. I mean, despite the fact that you and I might look different or sound different, we actually have much more in common in terms of our relationship with Singapore than it might seem at the surface. Because for me, I actually fell in love with a Singaporean before I fell in love with Singapore. So I've been coming back and forth to Singapore for, for way more than a decade now. And we decided to headquarter the Global Resilient Cities Network, which is a network that looks at systemic resilience and how we make cities stronger, safer, and more equitable and more lovable in many ways, based here because of the incredible story that Singapore has and the incredible capacity that Singapore has. So it's been a fantastic journey to get here. And I think when we look at cities and their lovability, we start off not unlike we'd start any relationship. So to fall in love, you need to be excited and you need to see some kind of opportunity. So if a city is not going to reel you in with, some exciting food, some exciting skyline, some exciting art scene, you might not end up there in the first place, or if there's not opportunity, right? So many of us move because of jobs, because of what we're looking for. And so for that initial spark you need excitement and you need opportunity, but then what is enduring? And I think Tongi and Yvonne have talked about this in a really beautiful way. There has to be that maturation, right? From the excitement, the spark, and the opportunity to a relationship with your city that is one of trust, that's one of admiration, and that is one of mutual contribution. And I think there's a lot more we could talk about in relationship to this, because it's not just, you know, what our cities can do for us, but what we can do for our cities, and where we feel that we're given the opportunity to participate and contribute in this love, right? And in what we make of our cities, because cities by definition are actually gatherings of people in concentrated areas, because we're pursuing some kind of common economic or common social purpose. So, you know, what we need for cities to be lovable is for them to foster this kind of trust. And for some people that means, you know, like the gentleman was talking about before in the opening, what Mark was talking about, maybe that means reliable infrastructure to some people, being able to trust that your city is going to take care of you, can get from point A to point B safely. Maybe that trust means that when you fall on hard times, your city has a social safety net, right? And that's going to take care of you. And I think that in particular right now, you know, in COVID-19, that is so important, that people think that they're going to be taken care of. And then finally that, you know, that interplay, right? So what can I do in my city? Can I be an active participant in shaping the future, right? In bringing that idea, right? Or bringing that excitement back into the city? And does the city have a place for me in that future? So that's what I would say. And, you know, I think Singapore has a lot to offer in those spaces. I've certainly come to love Singapore very much. And I think as, you know, as a professional, the idea, I would say the cornucopia of ideas that's available in Singapore is a pretty impressive one. We can't take advantage of it now, but the gateway to, you know, Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia is a phenomenal loveability aspect. But even in these times of trouble, the sense of community and the ability to know that you will be taken care of, that you do have institutions that are looking out for you and providing for your family, and that, you know, the schools will go on, the transport will go on. You know, these are realities that many around the world are grappling with right now, and the results have been rather less appealing.
Agreed. No, we are definitely in very strange times with a double whammy of a pandemic and a global recession. And Singapore, a lot of people confidently feel is a place that will love you back in this context and will take care of you. And this is a longitudinal study we want to do. So it'd be interesting to see as time goes on how that might differ. And you're right, you've been here longer, but you and I both made choices to be here. So that does say that we're willing to take on the good and the bad with this. It's very interesting. Now, I know we talked about this before, and I'm going to come back to you on this again, but is there a country, you got to pick your child at least, is there a country that immediately comes to mind? And that's something we can explore more with you as well.
Yeah, so when you and I talked about this before, I said it's very difficult for me to pick a city. There are 97 incredible and progressive cities in our network, and it sometimes feels like being asked to pick a favorite child. So I will just say that there are some cities that I think do loveability very well. I think Kyoto is a fantastic example of building on history, embracing the future, you know, whether it's just food or manga, or really trying to draw people in and constantly reinvent itself on the back of a completely rich and inspiring history. In terms of, you know, little cities that could, I think there's a lot to love about Penang and Malacca, and where they are in their journey as cities. And I think I would be not being very truthful if I didn't say that both New York and Barcelona, for me, are cities that, you know, I have spent a lot of time in, having grown up on the East Coast of the US and lived in New York, that have that opportunity and that sense of energy and openness and possibility that I think makes them incredibly lovable and allows them to keep reinventing themselves in the face of difficulty.
Yeah, so I think the discourse we're having now and the study we're doing, the DST is running, will have broad implications. I'd love to test it with these other cities as well. But at this point, I'd like to take a pause and bring the audience in. And so when the audience came in, they had a polling question. There are 3 questions. Can we pop up their answers and see how they responded to a similar question? So let's see. The first question was, on a scale of 0 to 5, how lovable is Singapore? And we got 32% with 3, 49% with 4, 10% with 5, and no zeros or ones, and 2 people or 6% saying not so lovable. This actually mirrors the study that when Mark and Janine said we kind of reached out at the beginning. It mirrors that a lot. So pretty high leaning towards a lovable space. Now let's think about why or why not. That's the second and third question. This would be a little tougher. Can we go to the next 2? Okay, let me move my screen here. So here the question was, what are some important factors that make Singapore lovable or unlovable for you? At the same list, and we said what's lovable, and pick 2 that makes it lovable and pick 2 that makes it unlovable. Let's look at this for a second. So safety and security makes it lovable. In current context, absolutely understand that. Personal agency and civic participation, Tong-Yi, this is your space, is what makes it most unlovable. Second place for lovable would be family and friends. Okay, that's great. And then a lot of 30s, values and culture, physical environment, memories and nostalgia, future potential. Okay, on the unlovable side, winning by a large margin is personal agent civic participation. And number 2 is values and culture. Interesting, okay. Physical environment is 30, that's surprising. And the rest are kind of low, memories and nostalgia, future potential. I invite any of the panelists to comment on these. Anything surprising here?
I don't think they're too surprising, actually, Delisha. I think the conversation that you and I had ahead of this panel, and then what I talked about in the third point of that mutual support, that really seems like it resonates with this audience. That ability to have personal agency and participate in the shape of the city seems like such a missed opportunity in Singapore, and one that is ready to be harnessed in a lot of ways. It's something you hear a lot, or I hear a lot, I think, when I talk to younger Singaporeans, and I've had the privilege of speaking at a lot of different events for NUS or NTU and SMU as well. And I'm consistently impressed by the knowledge, and these tend to be folks who are in the urban planning sphere or economics or sustainability, the knowledge that students have. And so to have that level of capacity, especially when you consider where Singapore is sitting in the region, we do a lot of work across ASEAN, and just by comparison, let's say that the statistics show about 60% of the people who are working in government in secondary cities, which are the fastest growing in Indonesia, haven't finished a college degree. And then you have this amazing capacity and level of engagement and desire to engage here in Singapore, and people don't feel like they have the opportunity. So I think there's a desire, and there's this incredible untapped potential for this lovability work.
So we saw that somewhat as an outside observer from the general elections this year, but I want to pull Tong-Yi into this conversation. This is your domain where you dedicated your life and your work to this for the last many years. What is your take on this?
It's interesting. I was looking at the pinks: safety and security, personal agency, and participation and future potential. And I'm seeing a sort of a polarity there. I know that right now in the season of where Singapore is and the phase of development it is, I know there's a lot of energy on the government's part to try and co-create and co-collaborate together with, I guess, people as much as possible. But I do know itself that there is that struggle, I guess. I mean, if we go back to the metaphor of the relationship, the struggle between the parent that says, when do I let go? And if I do let go, you know, and I don't control the shit out of my kid, you know, is my kid going to do his own duties? Is he, you know, do I dare let him fail? And it's interesting over here because I think even right now in the social and civic side, there are multiple organizations that are stepping up to, I guess, fill the gaps and try to actually just self-solve, you know, self-create our own civic solutions. But if I were to be honest over here, many organizations are not at the scale at which the government can therefore begin to fill this particular gap. So if they were to pull back, the question is whether we have the ability to scale as quickly or as effectively as, you know,
there's a question
what we're
about
seeing in the country now.
There's a question of maturity. There's a question of maturity about the ground up capability to fill in the gap if the parents were to step away.
I'm not so sure about maturity. My sense over here is that as far as the knowledge and concepts and experience is concerned, the maturity is there. Capacity, yeah. I'm not so sure. Yeah.
Capacity. Okay.
Capacity. Yeah.
So there's a question here from the audience I want to bring back from Louis. Here's, why do we need to love Singapore? Is that even a requirement? I mean, it's a little bit different, and Ivana and I talked about this before. It's a little bit different from kind of a choice that you make with a lover or a wife or a mistress or whichever one you choose, to a girlfriend, boyfriend, where it's a choice, right? Here, you're born to it. It is not a choice. It's kind of been born into a family. That is who you have to deal with. So do we need to love Singapore is a question.
No, but I think these are themes that, sorry, Yvonne, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I'll do a very quick one. I think these are themes that actually both Yvonne and Lauren have actually brought up earlier, that love has a lot to do with resilience. Love has a lot to do with commitment. In our world, we often say itself that those who are passionate are the willing sufferer. That we know someone itself is in passion when they're willing to suffer, right? And they're willing itself, right, to put in, I guess, the pedal to the metal. Yeah. And in doing so over here, I think that's really something where I think there is real strong, I would say even economic value as far as love is concerned, with regards to, you know, not having brain drain, keeping basically your talent within your country, coming to a space over here where if a crisis happens, that we are willing itself, right, to commit, to do what's necessary itself, right, to get us back on track. And this is a lot to do itself with whether we love our cities. Yeah, Yvonne, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just listening to both of you speak. I think one of the issues that is voiced or unvoiced here is that there is a conflation between the city, the country, and our political culture. And that, I think, is at the heart of this, that there is the desire not to love because I don't love the PAP or the government, whichever the government of the day is. And the government may provide the security, but, you know, it's not providing the personal agency or the levels of civic participation I so desire. So I find that there is sometimes among Singaporeans, because of the dominance of a political language, and it's a political language that has started from a day of our political independence, that has in some ways colored our view of what is society, what is the culture, what is public discourse, and therefore what is Singapore. And I think, you know, that really needs to be addressed. And I'm also very conscious, because I did ask the organizers who's in this conversation, and I have a sneaking suspicion that we're going to have quite a couple of public servants in this conversation. And that to me is troubling. When public servants say there is no sense of personal agency and civic participation, because you set that tone. I mean, you know, and there is a question from Melanie here, who is the city council, the people? And I think that this really gets at the heart of the maturity or immaturity, if you will, of our society, that there is some sense that it is conflated with a dominant political culture and a lack of understanding with the diversity of that language, the diversity of voices, and how you can participate politically, or maybe not politically, socially, culturally, vis-a-vis that political culture. So to me, that feels like something that gets at the part of that love, if you will, yeah.
This is a very good point. And so DSG is a semi-governmental entity, and talking on language, one of the questions or the subtitles of this whole thing is a lovable city by design. Can you even create a lovable city by design, or is that an oxymoron on its own? Can you force someone to love you? Or can you create the conditions in such?
Well, again, I guess because the SG is a public sector, it reflects a certain degree of governance, and and how do you create environments that reflect the values of that culture? I know values and culture kind of sits in this very awkward space of 31% lovable and 57% unlovable. So it means that there is, to me, the ones where it's not so clear cut are where there is some sense of tension. And what do we understand by values and culture? How much of that values and culture is determined by official speak and public bodies and folks in authority? How much of that values and culture is kind of ground up? And I think that's where the tension may be. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get to a few other topics. Please do keep sending the questions. There's some really good questions. I'm going to come back to this. We had the word resilience mentioned a couple of times, and this is Lauren's domain of expertise. Like you said, your 97 cities, a global resilient city network. What's the connection between resilience and lovability? Lauren.
So resilience, the way we define it for the urban form, is the ability for everyone, from the citizen up to the business and then the institutions and the system of the city, to survive, adapt, and to thrive, no matter what kind of shock or stress you might face. So inherent in that definition is a real holistic look at a city and what it will do. And in the same sense, when we think about love, we think about the whole, right, of the person, of the city. And we also acknowledge flaws along with strong points, right? We don't ignore them, right? And we love in spite of them, and we work on supporting them. And that's very similar to resilience practice, because you are only as resilient as the weakest point in your system. And similarly in a relationship, right? You are only going to be able to love as far as you can understand and overcome those difficulties. So I think it's so interesting to hear about, the different ways that you can pull apart some of the results of this survey and the others that you've done, because Singapore in so many ways is a system of systems, right? You have a national system layered on essentially what geographically is a city system, right? And we see similar things happening in other city states. So you look at this and you have to say, well, what about my system is weak, right? Is it my leadership in institutions? Is it my physical environment? Is it the interplay between those? And you have to see what's happening at that whole level and then address it and prioritize. And you have to do that with a lot of love. The other thing that's very common to resilience and love is that medium long-term view, right? This is not a short-term game. You cannot build resilience with Band-Aids. Impossible. You cannot build on quicksand, right? You actually have to set a solid foundation. So there has to be a common understanding. And that's the last point that I would leave it with, which is that both love and resilience rest on having a very clear-eyed view of your current starting point. You have to know where you are in order to build resilience. You have to know where you are in order to build lovability. You can't be building it based on any kind of false pretenses or false advertising or the profile picture that you saw once on the dating app and you happen to swipe one way versus the other. It is a much longer term, deeper commitment.
So it's a great answer. And again, bringing back to a human relationship idea, people change, times change. So you might get together in one context, but then times do change, countries change, people like, communities change, there's an evolution to it. So the thing you mentioned about a long-term point of view brings to mind one of the prior conversations with Tong Yi about having the infrastructure, the bones, Singapore having good bones, but then talking about it. Tong Yi, can you expand on that, the analogy you brought forward there?
We often use the analogy of bones, organs, and flesh and blood. That Singapore, as far as bones are concerned, that's the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right. Organs are your institution. And I think we've built some pretty solid institutions and pretty solid infrastructure. But in our second phase of development, we really are into issues of flesh and blood. Right? Who is flesh of my flesh? Who is blood of my blood? And the whole question itself that we ask us is that success will naturally breed diversity, right? As long as you're successful, diversity will come. People will come to be a part of the city. They will flock into the city over here. And I think we have huge inclusion issues right now over a question of who is a part of us and who is not a part of us, right? And these inclusion issues, I think they are incredibly difficult to talk about. I was taking a bit of what Lauren was saying, and what Yvonne was saying. And I noticed that there's one thing, I hope this doesn't distract too much. I just have to say it. If there's one thing itself I can't personally stand about Singapore, is that because we've designed ourselves so successful that we can't blemish it. We can't talk about the suicide, and we can't talk about the homelessness, and we can't talk about basically whatever is going on over there. And every time itself I bring it up, they will euphemize it, for God's sake. So yeah, and we don't express the vulnerability. There is no space for citizens to grow. Only when the vulnerability is expressed, then there's a space for civic action, civic capacity to come in and fill that particular space. But we have to be able to name it, right? And not put ourselves as perfect as we are, because we're not, right? Obviously, every relationship is going to have an issue, right, or a shadow of some kind.
Oh, completely agree. Yeah. And I've been a third culture person. I mean, I'm a US citizen. Spent my whole adult life in the US. But at any point, if I'm critical about the US, and I am on many occasions, they would say, well, go back to where you came from kind of response. I mean, maybe not in the same way. And that is a similar lack of capacity to kind of endure a critique and a way to kind of say, we got to move forward. But I want to switch more to kind of a less spoken side and bring Yvonne into this about loveability. Now, one of the questions when we reached out and did a survey and did some questionnaires about this, we talked about arts and culture. And we said, how much does it matter? And some people came back with effusive, I love Singapore for how much it celebrates its arts and culture. I love kind of the landscape we've built around it and how we've attracted prominent artists and like all of these people to come in and build that for Singapore, and how we've also expanded our own. And then there were other responses that said, I don't care for any of it. These museums are built for tourists, not for me. I don't ever go to one of these things. It does nothing for me. So Yvonne, I want to pull arts and culture into this conversation and say, how does that matter for a lovability of a city?
Yeah, well, before we get to arts and culture, it just struck me listening to the other panelists too, that the other point of kind of where we have conflated things, and I think this is what makes it difficult, is the difference between city and country. You know, so if I use a relationship, you know, you date a guy, you like him, that's your city, but he comes with a family, and that's your country, right? And somehow I think that's one of the issues here, that we actually have a very tight country, and we don't have multiple cities through which you can disperse your tensions, or you can disperse your, you know, the little things that you may like, right? You like this about New York, but you may then go to the West Coast for something else completely different. Here there is that conflation. So, you know, that question that you had asked me, and I should really have addressed it, who deserves more or less love in Singapore? Yeah. Is that, you know, unfortunately, if you have chosen to kind of marry that Singapore you've not chosen to, it comes with a family. And it's a very small and tight family, which means you got to love that whole darn thing. Everybody deserves that love in Singapore. And that's one of the conundrums of being in this country. You know, so we're not looking at a lovable city. The problem is we're looking at a lovable country. And it's actually very hard to look at a lovable country. It's a lot easier to look at you know, it's like New York is okay now, but the whole America with Trump, maybe not, right? So lovable cities, easier. Lovable countries, a lot tougher. And
But hold on, in the context of Singapore, I must say, like, it's a city country, right? I mean,
yeah, that's right.
Pretty close together.
And that's, I think that's one of the tensions here, because actually you do get that diversity and the conflicts, right, between very, very different social demographic groups. You are very different. You're clearly, you know, both Lauren and yourself are very globalized citizens, comfortable in cities. But, you know, we will have another significant proportion who are different. And for me, I may be very comfortable in city. I have family members who are not, you know. So again, I think that helps to, or rather that contributes to some of the tensions that we are seeing in the surveys and in the questions. But back to your question on arts and culture, I think for me, what arts and culture do is it gives us a language. It gives us a language to talk about who we are outside of politics, which dominates in some countries, and outside of the language of the media, which has always been dominating. Artists provide a language of conscience, provide a language for us to think about the past and the future that is actually independent of a politicized language or a very political language, or language that is created for political ends, and a language that is created to sell something. I mean, at the end of the day, the media wants to sell something. So to me, that's the heart of arts and culture, not necessarily seen in orchestras or ballet companies or whatever is exported, but the tools it then gives a country and its people to be able to express itself in song, in poetry, in, you know, street culture, in dances at weddings, in songs in churches, or, you know, just stuff that you speak and you act out your emotions or your aspirations outside of political language and outside of a very media contained language. And I think in some ways it therefore is a more authentic language.
So it is a bridge, and it is something that cuts across many different, across age groups, across all the different markers we have to separate each other. Now, you had two images you shared. Would any of those be relevant in the context of this conversation?
Yeah. Okay, so sorry. I don't want to be talking too much, but I'll just call out those two images, or the secretary can do that. And I think that addresses some of these questions that folks have been posting about generational differences, you know, who is involved. You know, when the Esplanade was built, the architects, half of them were British, and, you know, they built this, and you see this image, architecturally, I would say lovely, you know, it's got nice lines, it lets in the light, it's got these triangles that mimic the dome, but it's an empty space. It's a cold and empty space. And I think our responsibilities to make this space, and in some ways the country, lovable is in the next slide. And actually what, you know, the Esplanade and its 20 years have been doing is to turn that space into simply a space where different people gather. I mean, this is the image of a seniors festival that we do called A Date with Friends, right? So there was a question about generational differences. And we always think that old people, you know, they don't express their love. You come to a festival like this, and you get aunties and uncles in their 60s playing the ukulele, you know, and they are having a party. They will sing along and they will dance along. But at the heart of it, you know, who do you make this space for? Who do you want to come into your country? Is your country or your space able to reflect the goals, the dreams, the aspirations, the messiness of life, if you will, of all these different people who come? And are you actually able to contain that and accept that? You know, the reality is, you know, we talked about homelessness as well. I think somebody mentioned that. I know maybe 3 homeless I don't really know if they're homeless. They're always hanging around the Esplanade with their bags. You know, they watch all our free performances. They sit, they use our toilets. We know them by name. I think some of our staff know them very well. And they love being in this center. They're just comfortable. They're not judged. And I do think this is the space that the arts allow, because unlike other public spaces, artists, those of us who work in culture, our instincts are to empathize and to want to relate in whatever way you come to us in. So that's my long, short answer. It covers, I guess, several aspects of what, Dulisha, you have raised.
Yeah. No, it is true. And in this reflection, I mean, what you said about the US, and it's a far cry from the country I went to, 25 years ago. But at the same point, we were in San Francisco. We took to the streets for many of these issues, including with our 3 kids. And there was a sense of connection as an agency that came with that, a sense that you had a say that is structurally missing in Singapore. There are many other positive elements. But I want to switch to some of the audience questions. This is again this is our, with this project, with this effort, this initiative, is our first kind of opening it up to the public. There's some great questions. I'm going to pull in some of these questions. So one of the questions is, could the panelists share their thoughts on the loving critic argument by Professor Tommy Coe? I'm not as familiar with this, but I could presume what it is. Do you think that the more someone loves a city country, the more the critic tends to be? Or the opposite end, someone else who doesn't love the city country would be apathetic, dispassionate about its state. I've read some of Professor Coe's stuff, and I like it. It's definitely on the provocative edge and some of the discourse that's needed. Anyone want to take a stab at that to start off? On the loving critic and the role of the loving critic?
I can take a short answer on that, and it comes from where we operate from with all of our cities, and that is absolutely that is true. It needs to be done. The criticism needs to come from a place of love, and a place that is also, as I mentioned earlier, holistic, right? Not throwing out, the flaws without appreciating where they've come from. And I think, Tony, you talked about this before, in that tension in Singapore about letting go, right? Because all of these gains were so hard won, and they are unparalleled, right? We really can't take that away from Singapore. To have come so far and to have crowded in so much value into such a tiny space and to create a multicultural society is phenomenal. And, I cannot really find any other example across a global network of a city who's been able to deliver that many benefits. At the same time, if that becomes complacency, right, and sort of that laziness that's implied by the argument, you lose that edge, right? And the next generation, if they're not involved in that fight in a compelling way, then they would become complacent, right? So it's not a either edge. You have to be empowered. And I think what's really impressive about people like Tommy Coe and people in the pioneer generation who get really fired up is they love and they care because they were given the ability to be part of that co-creation in a deeply meaningful way. I mean, if you talk to someone like Tai Kerr, he is still fired up about whether or not certain roadways should be built to accommodate 10 million people or not. And I know that's a very controversial number, right? And, probably not a number that Singapore is going for, but these folks were empowered. So the question is really, where is the empowerment? And I think this goes a bit to what Yvonne was just talking about, which is such an amazing frontier, that Singapore has to figure out how you get that criticism and that energy and that co-creation into the Venn diagram between the hard and soft, because the hard is done very well. And the soft needs a lot of work, whether that's in the arts, or whether that's in activating communities, or whether that's in community rain gardens that absorb floodwaters, because there's just no way PUB can build enough drainage to deal with climate impacts. So I think that that's where there's a lot of space for this. And, getting passionate, being that loving critic is so essential.
Yeah. Chong-Yi, Yvonne?
I was, I don't know what I'm saying, whether it's too controversial. I'm going to take a stab at this. The critique typically comes from love. Typically they wouldn't open their mouth in the first place, right? So I think having the prefix to say itself that, critics should be loving was more Tommy Coe's way itself of basically just saying, chill out, try and find some moderation in what you're saying. if you can speak from a space of a larger picture, then maybe itself, like, you'll be less, chastised. But the whole job of the critic is the prophet. The prophet is never loved in their own hometown. The prophet brings the end is near, rings that bell, and basically says a horrible message over here that no one wants to hear. But the bottom line itself is, again, it's not so much the critic, it's the loving audience that I'm concerned about. Are we so thin-skinned that we cannot take criticism, that we cannot learn? And I'm much more concerned about the audience, about, I don't know, the sensitivity of whoever's listening to the critic, right? That's getting all riled up, there. And I think it's a lot to do itself with, like, even what I think Yvonne must be, I imagine, dealing with it on a daily basis. Who do we allow, what actor or actresses, right, do we allow out, and what artists do we allow out? But the concern of the artist is that the artist will always have a loving message. The question is whether the audience is ready for it, right? So when it comes down to the loving critic, I don't know. I'd rather not go into names or things like that. But I think many of the people who've been speaking about Singapore have been coming from a space of love. Yeah, and then we question their love when they say something that's not, palatable. That's a reflection of our maturity, not theirs.
Mm.
Yeah.
Good point. Now, Yvonne, do you have something to add to that?
No, I think they've said most things.
That's very well said. There's another question here, and this, Yvonne, brings back to a conversation we had, and it says, hey, this conversation, we brought up relationships in many cases. By the way, after this, I think many people are going to choose not to get married because we brought up all the baggage that comes with marriage. But but anyway, there's a choice related to it, but you don't get bound to it. So what is the responsibility for those who don't have the choice to leave, who can just pick up and say, this doesn't work for me, I'm going to make another choice? Like, if that's not available to them. Yvonne, you and I talked about that. Want to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, if I go back to you marry whoever it is, or you date whoever, you inherit their baggage, right? Their family. And I think most people, I did ask DSG, most people you speak to are people who have that choice. They can choose to love Singapore, or be that loving critic, or live in whichever city they want to, and occasionally come back and still profess a love. We are highly mobile, but there's a large number of people in this country who cannot leave this country. What does it mean? What are their views? What do they love about Singapore? Who loves them back? What is the country's responsibility in loving them back, with or without their contribution? I think those are the responsibilities of folks. I speak like, we've been educated, we benefited from the system. That's our responsibility, constantly to see how is it that you then take care of the rest of the clan, if you will, the rest of the family, because if nothing else, you first loved your whoever you married, right? And you then extend that love to everybody else. And that is the real question. How do we love the very weakest in the country? How do we choose to love the folks who seem to be politically very extreme and radical, the folks who speak the harshest things and we don't agree with? I think those are the questions as a city or maybe a country we will need to address. And the arts confronts these issues all the time. And
Absolutely. I was going to say, this is a really good space for arts to come into play. And just for context for the audience, in this conversation, we really stretched a lot in the sense of what is love? What does it mean to be a lovable city or a country? Why does it even matter? In the second conversation, the second webinar, it'll be much more tactical. Okay, all this talk is great, but what do you do about it? How does it manifest in the city itself? So the partners in this study include URA and MCCY. They are going to take input from the study to say, well, okay, where does placemaking come into play? So to your context of art could be really brought in to a way that it can help bridge some of the gaps that exist today. And to Tong Yi's work on with Common Ground and the Thought Collective and everything else, there could be a lot that could be brought in from kind of the findings from this work that get manifested in kind of the day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it is a social question. We built our best designed spaces, you know, Duxton, right in the middle of the city,
Yeah.
right? You take 3 minutes drive down, you're in Bukit Merah, Red Hill, and gangs there, right? Or lots of old people. Or take the other direction, you're at Chin Swee, lots of old people who live there as well. Now, the measure of the city is how we should be spending more time, more monies, more energy, bettering those communities and their living and physical spaces. If, you know, obviously, ideally, we shouldn't have to choose, but I think the measure of the strength of a country is therefore then, what is Bukit Merah like? And what is Chin Swee like? And how are we making the lives of the people there better? That will make this city a whole lot more lovable. Or rather, it will not make, it may or may not make the city lovable, but it will show that the city has love.
Yeah. All right, I want to come back to you. You mentioned a few cities, Barcelona, Kyoto, Milan, New York, and in a prior conversation you mentioned Lagos. Do any of these other cities showcase the conversations we had today around vulnerability, authenticity, trust, agency? Do they do it well? What can we learn from them?
Absolutely. I mean, all of these cities, and again, it comes back to this parallel between resilience and love. All of these cities have been working with us on a resilience plan that, by definition, is inclusive and by definition is holistic. So when we look at planning from a resilience perspective, we always look at 4 dimensions. We always look at health and well-being, so those basic needs. We always look at economy and society and encompassing issues like Yvonne was just talking about is, where are our most vulnerable citizens? Is there social mobility? Are there neighbors taking care of neighbors? Infrastructure environment, so those infrastructure services, are we taking care of nature? Do they have a supportive or destructive relationship? And then leadership and strategy. So how are we actually building that pipeline? How are we involving people in the discussion about the future? And how solid is our vision? Do we have the right institutional capacity to carry it out? So in that vein, when we work with each of these cities, we create a committee, right, to do the resilience plan and to check it, right? So that committee has to have representation from youth, from arts, from the private sector. It's not a all government committee with a representative from each department. It might start there, but it needs to at least be double that size, right? Because it actually needs to look like your city looks. And you also have to think about what your city will look like, right? If your city is a very young city, then you need to have more youth representation. If your city is an aging city, then you need to think more about that as well. And so in that vein, these cities take it very, very seriously to be inclusive and to have a real conversation about what's going to build their resilience and have people in love, right, and involved in that strategy. And I can share actually in the chat with the group members, there's a phenomenal YouTube video that our Chief Resilience Officer from Lagos just posted this weekend about their strategy. And you can see the different people in the video talking about what the strategy means to them and why it gives them hope about their city, which is a mega city with lots and lots of challenges, but they talk openly about it. And they talk about what they're going to do about it and how those priorities have been derived through an inclusive process. And that's really key to going forward. You know, you can't build love, you can't build loveability, you cannot build resilience without having an open and inclusive conversation and prioritizing things from a differentiated group of stakeholders that reflects the citizenry of your city.
Well, whatever we built here as a framework to test lovability of a city, I'd love to come back to you and extend it to these other cities and see how it works over there. So we're coming to the close of our conversation. I'm going to continue with a few more questions with the panelists that came up here. And I want to get their kind of closing thoughts. But there's some great questions from the audience. I want to go back to those as well. But we also want to open up a polling question to the audience. You've been amazing in writing things on as we came along. I'd love for you to take this final poll as we continue this conversation. So can we put up the Menti code for this? what is it or who have we missed out in our discussion today? Like I said, this is the beginning of a much bigger, longer discussion. So what have we not talked about? What did we miss? What did we not say? What did we not talk about? What should we explore more? Add those all in. There's a QR code that's going to come in next. And there's the Menti. If you go to menti.com and put in that code 90515952, we'll put it in. So this is going to go on in the background. It's in your chat as well. So work on that. And as you fill in your answers, it'll pop up in a word cloud. But as we go to that, I want to, I have a few more questions here from the audience that I'll bring to our panelists. It says, okay, it feels a lot like the factors affect lovability are quite out of the regular citizen's hands. Is there anything that the ordinary person living in Singapore can do to foster lovability for the city? That's a very good question that we should all have a simple answer to. What can all of us, like there's a sense of what can I do, right? So can I get some responses? I'd love to get a response from each of you in terms of what the day-to-day person can do to make Singapore more lovable.
I'm just giving, I don't know.
Can you go
Should I
first?
jump in first?
Yeah, please.
It doesn't matter. Okay. Everyday people. In a lot of the work you do to facilitate, before we go into the how, I think we need to establish the what.
Okay.
So a lot of the times over here, citizens keep asking, how do we do this? How do we do that? How do we, run out over the case? I'm not really sure that we have yet to establish for ourselves as a country, what is the way forward or what is the new narrative. The whole Singapore third world to first story has expired some time ago already, but yet we don't have a new vision or new aspiration point as to what exactly the city is about. What exactly is this country about? And I think we've had some attempt at basically saying Singapore together, but that's a mechanism, it's not a vision. The mechanism itself of us coming together is basically how we're going to do it. We're going to do it together. But where are we going? I don't know. So the thing about this over there is that the what question needs to be answered. And I think citizens need to come to the table to speak about this. I'm not sure itself, right, whether or not Singapore is yet, or the Singaporeans are yet aware of the fact that this is a political conversation, but it's not one that political leaders can answer. Not at this stage of our development. Yeah, it is a political conversation. It's a conversation that all of us need to begin to voice out and just say over here, so what's the next phase and what's the next step? Yeah, and we've had the tradition of multiple prime ministers before that, always defining for us what the next step is. But I'm suspecting itself, right, at 50 years on forwards over here, no prime minister, no matter how freaking charming they are over here, can actually name this question to a country as diverse and as mature and as affluent as our own. So if citizens want to start playing a part, open your mouth. We really need the understanding of what is next. Yeah, and that's something, even as a facilitator, I have the energy to bring people to the table, but I can't do the work for them.
Okay, so I do have an outside-in challenge. One of the top things that came up in this word cloud, as you see, is freedom of speech. How do they open their mouth? Where do they say something? Do they become a netizen? Like where's their space? And this could actually overlap with arts, but how do they open their mouth? Where do they have a say?
It's something that I have I don't know. Okay, so this could be my own privilege speaking. I'm not so sure whether I named this right. The horrible culture we have over defamation suits and God knows whatever lawsuits that come around have largely been around malignment or some kind of defamation, right? I don't think I have seen opinions that people express necessarily become a legal issue.
Okay.
Yeah. So I know that actually all sorts of controversial shit is being said at the Esplanade all the time, but I'm not sure everyone goes to court for it. Yeah. And in doing so over here, I don't know. I say a lot of horrible things all the time over here. I don't go to jail for it, but that's why I don't know whether that's a reflection of my own privilege, right? Such that I don't get nailed to the cross. But I don't know. I put it out as an idea. I think you can nail 1 to 2 people on the cross and people will be scared enough. I'm not sure you can nail 10,000 people to the cross.
Yeah. So your response to that question is speak up. What you can do every day as an everyday citizen is to speak up, to have a voice.
What is the vision? What is the vision that we're heading towards? Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you want for Singapore? Yeah.
Yeah. Yvonne, Lauren?
Well, you know, that vision is of course something which, in a political context, that's your highest level of leadership, right? And as a voter, you influence that debate. Tong Yi spoke about whether all kinds of shit gets spoken in the Esplanade. I'm sure that, I mean, the reality is the arts provide that safe space. But you know what? The shit that gets spoken is also in context. Now, it makes a big difference when you put that shit out. I'm sorry, it's all about context. In a theater space, the context is that it's a safe space. The lights darken, we have agreement with the other person who has bought a ticket that we are here because we want to be challenged, or we want to listen to something. We may not agree, but we all agree this is the space we're in. And I think part of the political debate is also about context of speaking. You writing something on your random Facebook versus you signing up for a political party. And I think we really need to understand the context for conversations better, and then be able to construct rules around those contexts of conversation. And that brings me to my third point, which is, what does the ordinary Singaporean do if you are not necessarily voting every 5 years because you have to wait 5 years, right? Or you're not going to run for whatever party? What is there left for you to do? And I think the context is, if we shrink the city, expand it, it's the country. But if you shrink the city down, you're then in your neighborhood. I know I've lived in Toa Payoh for the last maybe 15 years. I live in a 4-room HDB flat. I love Toa Payoh, right? And what I do then as a citizen, because it's an extension of my love for the city or the country, is I'm as friendly as I can be to my neighbor. If I see somebody or in my block, I always try to say hello. I form relationships with my community. I speak of it. If I find something good about in my neighborhood that I can love about it, I tell somebody else. It's the same in your relationship, right? If you love your partner and you find something good about your partner, you are boasting about it all the time to somebody else. If you find a flaw, you kind of, I got tons of rats at one point in Toa Payoh, there were a lot of rats, right? What did I do? I wrote a note because I couldn't take it. It's like, look, this is Singapore. We cannot be having rats around. So I went up to the MP or whatever. You can, in your community, do something. So I think the city is somewhere in between. The country, of course, is where you get political discourse. But for the ordinary Singaporean, and I see that you don't need to be educated. I've got, family members who are not terribly educated. They love living in Sengkang. They're always telling me to go Sengkang to eat this or that or to visit them, But I think we do need to think of our neighborhoods not as investments and not measured purely by its economic status. And then I think you will sink roots. And once you sink roots, which is somebody asked that question, right? Mistress or wife. Once you are committed to that, you kind of are forced, because your fate is intertwined with that community. You cannot just simply step away. I'm thinking really hard about moving out of Toa Payoh, It's like every time somebody says, hey, look, there's a flat available here, come and stay near me. I'm like, no, I want to live in Toa Payoh. But that comes from a lot of roots, if you will, and investments I have made in the relationships, acknowledged or otherwise, with this town. So I do think the ordinary Singaporean can do that. Keep your town clean, don't litter, be friendly to your neighbor. All that is part of those are loving acts, I think.
Those are very loving acts, I agree. And those are very simple ones. Okay, so Tong Yi, speak out. Yvonne, be loving to your neighbors, speak out about what you love. You have something to add, Tong Yi?
Yeah, could you just give me a minute? Lauren, do you mind just giving me a minute before you...
Go for it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to make sure I squeeze this in. It's I may die if I don't say it. It was basically what Yvonne was saying around context, and I want to just speak on behalf of the social sector of what is it that we are seeing on the ground around basically how citizens can begin to really contribute and work, right? With as a nation as young as ours and as fast moving as ours, I think we have not found a good space for grief and loss. We have not found the space that if we are as progressive and as fast moving as we are, there will be loss along the way, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have a space to speak about miscarriages. We don't have a space to speak about suicide of our children. We don't have a space itself to speak about childless couples or retrenchment or loss of heritage, right? Or any other things itself, right, that come about as a result of actually our living, right? And in doing so over here, I'm getting a sense over here that a lot of the anxiety and anger that we're expressing currently in Singapore, the context is sadness. The context is lost. It's not that Singapore is angry and Singapore itself is furious and talking about all things. Singapore just needs closure, or the Singaporeans need closure in multiple of the things that they think that they've paid for, right? It's a very heavy price of it. And this goes back a lot to what I said earlier. There are some things we don't dare talk about, but I think that if we don't talk about them, there isn't the space for that closure to happen, right? And it's quite critical, I think, that we open up that particular space. So if there's one thing that Singaporeans can do is learn to open space for one another. Learn to help people close in the issues that they begin to deal with on a daily basis. I know the social sector is actually really quite struggling, but the data is all over the country. We can see it, yeah. And yes, it's coming out in terms of mental health issues and so on and so forth, in terms of actually a lot of angry speech. But I think it's far more easy to present anger than to present sadness. Yeah. Okay, my apologies.
And mental health issues was the number one thing here. I do have an add-on to that, but Lauren, please, love your last word on in terms of what could the everyday Singaporean do to make the city more lovable.
It's really hard to follow two Singaporeans as a non-Singaporean, and looking at the list of issues there, it just brings me back to the fact that even the concept of resilience comes from a space of ecology and psychology, right? And being able to deal with difficulty and spring forward and making the spaces that, and what Tong Hee said was very, very beautiful about that. And I think if there's any kind of last word about that, I will actually end, unfortunately, with a bit of a management cliche. And that is, show me your budget and I'll tell you what your values are. And Singapore has been calling this recovery from COVID-19 the resilience budget. The investments should accrue to spaces that need this kind of empathy. Yeah. Because Singapore has created some of the most amazing, urban advisories, Savannah Jurong, or companies like Singtel or others that serve purposes of creating building blocks for a very high-powered, high-tech city and a smart city. Now, for that resilient, lovable, compassionate city, it's time to invest in that kind of a connective tissue, because where you invest, you will create innovation, you will create space, and your younger Singaporeans will have the ability to be the vanguard of these new industries that we as humanity so desperately need.
So your call to action is for the government to...
Or public-private partnerships, right? Create incentives for people to work together on these issues, because they are happening in other places, right? You see collaboration coming into Singapore on health issues. Some of these mental health issues already have rich collaboration here in Singapore. So maybe it's time to double down on those. Maybe it's time to really look at where those opportunities are in higher relief.
Delisha and Lauren, can I just ask a question? And in some ways, I'm echoing the questions from a couple of folks who have typed their written down. Do you, as kind of resident but non-citizen resident in Singapore, do you feel this discussion means something different to you? Because you have various home countries, you are highly mobile professionals. Do you feel pushed away by kind of recent political debate about citizens versus non-citizens? Just curious. And do you really seriously believe that a city or a country can be lovable if it has a very high proportion of resident, non-citizen, wealthy, educated people like yourselves? Just curious. I mean, so be frank, both of your views and your experiences having looked at, you know, cities like London, Barcelona, maybe.
So one caution, we are up on time.
We are out of time, but
So,
I don't want to avoid the question at all. I would say,
Yeah.
like, as a permanent resident and as a mother of two semi-Singaporeans, as they call them, I feel extremely invested in Singapore. And to be very honest, I think this is one of the best places to live and to invest. So I feel very invested in that. At the same time, it's been so interesting during the last election to see, you know, the debate around foreigners coming in. And I actually think it's really natural. I kind of welcome it to be out in the open and be a discussion, because if there are two candidates competing for a job and you have a fantastic local candidate, why would you bring in a foreigner, right? And I love working with Singaporeans. We're hiring, which is a shout out. So I'd love to hire more young Singaporeans who want to work on issues of resilience in cities, both here in Singapore and in the region. So I think it's a healthy conversation. When I look around Singapore and I see older Singaporeans who have to work well into their old age just to make it, you know, I think these are things that we all see, we all observe, and we need to create spaces to talk about. And we as foreigners are a big percentage of the population. And so there has to be a conversation about how to prioritize that and how to make the best of different talents and different groups in any city. And it's very, very common. So I think that's the other thing that I would point out, is that cities attract large groups of immigrants from lots of different places. And we get back into that conversation about city and country and scale. But I think it's a very natural conversation. It's a conversation that should be had. And I don't, as a foreigner, as a PR living here, have any issue engaging in that debate with friends, family, and colleagues.
Thank you.
We are out of time, so I'm going to give a quick answer of, like, in setting up the Center for the Age, I was debating between Tokyo, Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and chose Singapore in some part for personal reasons. Like I said, my wife is from here, but also because there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to go for Singapore. So longer conversation. I want to hand it back to Janine. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Lauren, Tongi, and Yvonne.
Thank you.
Thank you, the audience. You guys have been great. There's lots of questions we didn't get to answer. We'll try to answer them. I think all of us are very findable. We'd be happy to share our information if you want to follow up with any of us. Tongi, we're going to talk about bringing Burning Man or something similar to Singapore, because that is a festival of flipping orthodoxies and allowing people a space to be themselves and to grieve and to let go and to open up, and we can create a lot of that. And Yvonne will be a big part of that because she's leading that. Janine, back to you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Everybody, thank you so much for this really robust and exciting conversation. I just want to do a quick shout out for the second webinar, which will be happening on the 30th of September. And that's a follow-up to this webinar where we will be gathering design and urban practitioners to discuss and deliberate how we can practically build the future of livability in Singapore. So please join us, engage with us on our social media channels to get the invitation. And also, we would love to hear your feedback about this webinar. So on your screen, there are now 2 QR codes. On the left, it links to a quick post-event survey, and that link can also be found in the Zoom chat. Your answers will really help us to build better programs for you in the future. And on the right, if you'd like to find out more about programs the National Design Center has lined up under the theme Singapore Our Home, just head over to the QR code on the right. So again, thank you so much, Dulisha, Yvonne, Yi, and Lauren for the wonderful conversation. And to everybody who attended and is still with us, thank you for sharing your evening with us. So good night. And if anybody wants to rewatch this webinar, we'll be posting it on YouTube in a few days' time. So thank you and see you soon.